You don't have a discipline problem. You have a dopamine problem, and your brain engineered it from birth. That guitar still sitting in the corner, the half-finished course, the business plan you worked on obsessively for 3 weeks and then never touched again. These aren't failures of character. They are the predictable, inevitable output of a specific neurological loop, one that millions of people live with their entire lives without ever understanding why. Start everything, finish nothing. Here's what I need you to hold on to as we go through this. Researchers have mapped a precise neurochemical event that occurs in the ADHD brain the moment it encounters something new. And what they found explains every single abandoned project in your life. I will reveal that finding before this video ends, but the reason it matters goes much deeper than most people expect. In the next few minutes, we are going to trace the ADHD cycle, the invisible neurological loop that makes starting feel like electricity and finishing feel like slow suffocation. This is not about willpower. This is about brain architecture, and once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. The novelty trap. Think about the last time something new completely grabbed you. A new hobby, a new goal, a new skill you decided you absolutely had to learn. In the first few days you were consumed. You stayed up late, you couldn't stop thinking about it. You bought equipment, made plans, told people about it. You felt genuinely alive in a way that ordinary life rarely provides, and then without any warning at all, the spark died, not dimmed, died. This is called the novelty trap. And it is where the ADHD cycle begins. Neuroscientists have identified that novelty itself, encountering something genuinely unfamiliar, produces a dopamine release in a brain region called the nucleus accumbens, the brain's primary reward center. Dopamine is commonly described as the pleasure chemical, but that framing misses the point. What dopamine actually does is signal anticipation and motivation. It tells the brain, this matters, pay attention. Keep going. For most brains, this signal is moderate and sustains itself over time as progress is made. But for the ADHD brain, research consistently shows that the initial response to novelty is significantly more intense. Higher, faster, gone. The dopamine spike is more euphoric, but it is also front-loaded, arriving early and fading fast. You are not falling in love with the goal, you are falling in love with the beginning. And that single distinction changes everything about how you understand your own patterns. Because if the reward lies at the start, finishing becomes neurologically unrewarding by comparison. But this raises a darker question. Why does the ADHD brain work this way at all? The answer reveals something that most people, including many doctors, still get completely backwards. Dopamine decoded. Now here is something that will completely reframe how you see this, and it is more unsettling than you would expect. The ADHD brain does not have too much dopamine. It has too little, or more precisely, it has a dysfunctional dopamine regulation system. Studies from the National Institute of Mental Health show that ADHD brains have fewer dopamine receptors and lower baseline dopamine availability than neurotypical brains. This means that under ordinary, familiar, predictable circumstances, a routine task, a well-worn environment, a project past its novelty phase, the ADHD brain is essentially running on empty. The brain is not broken, it is underfueled, and constantly scanning its environment for the next chemical source of energy. This is precisely why novelty feels so disproportionately rewarding. For a brain starved of dopamine under normal conditions, a new stimulus is not merely interesting. It is a flood of relief. It is oxygen after minutes underwater. As psychiatrist Dr. Edward Hallowell, who has spent decades studying ADHD, put it, ADHD is like having a Ferrari engine with bicycle brakes. The power is there, the regulation is not. If this pattern is starting to sound familiar in your own life, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring the depths of your psyche with me. Because what comes next explains not just the trap, but why escaping it is so much harder than anyone admits. Because the problem is not just the beginning. It is what happens right in the middle, and precisely when the collapse arrives. The starting high. Stop and think about this for a second. When was the last time you felt truly, completely alive, not content? Alive, on fire, buzzing with energy and clarity, and a sense that this time was going to be different. For most people with ADHD, the answer to that question is immediate, at the start of something new. And that is not coincidence. Starting is neurologically engineered to feel incredible, specifically for the ADHD brain. When you begin a new project, your brain interprets the unfamiliar territory as a challenge worth solving. Research on reward prediction error, first described by neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz, demonstrated that dopamine is not released when you receive a reward. It is released when the reward is unexpected, when the outcome is still uncertain. Novelty and uncertainty trigger the exact same neurochemical cascade as winning. New, uncertain, electric. This is why the first week of a new gym routine feels incredible. why the first chapter of a new book is always the easiest to read, why new relationships feel magnetic and consuming. The ADHD brain does not merely enjoy beginnings, it gets chemically high from them. You are not falling in love with the goal, you are falling in love with not knowing how it ends. And that difference is the mechanism behind every abandoned project you have ever had, because once the outcome becomes predictable, once familiarity replaces uncertainty, the dopamine response diminishes sharply. Scientists call this dopamine habituation. For the ADHD brain, it happens faster than almost anyone realizes. But the crash itself, the moment the chemistry disappears entirely, that is what nobody prepares you for. The crash point. Here is where the story takes a dark turn. Around day 10 or week 3 or whatever the timeline happens to be for you, the excitement does not just fade, it crashes. And this is not metaphorical language. Neuroimaging studies show that when a stimulus becomes familiar, dopamine activity in the striatum, the brain's reward circuit, can drop by as much as 50 to 70% compared to the initial exposure. For a neurotypical brain, this registers as mild boredom. For the ADHD brain, it feels as though the lights went out entirely. Crash. Tasks that once felt electric now feel physically painful to engage with, not emotionally difficult, physically aversive. Dr. Russell Barkley, one of the world's leading ADHD researchers, has described ADHD as a disorder of motivation as much as a disorder of attention. Specifically, the inability to sustain motivation in the absence of immediate, salient reward. In plain language, the ADHD brain cannot produce its own fuel. When external novelty disappears, the engine stalls. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. And this is the precise moment the world misreads as laziness, procrastination, giving up without a real reason. But what is actually happening is a neurochemical drought. The brain is not refusing to work. It has run out of the chemistry it needs to continue. No fuel, no motion. This is why the ADHD graveyard of unfinished projects keeps growing, not because the person lacks passion, but because passion for the ADHD brain is dopamine, and dopamine has an expiration date on every project it touches. But what does this cycle do to a person's identity over years and decades? That answer is more destructive than the crash itself. Not lazy, wired. Let me pause here because this next part changes the entire picture. Every person who has ever been called lazy for not finishing what they started deserves to hear this stated clearly. Laziness is a moral judgment. Neurology is not. Laziness implies a conscious choice, a deliberate decision to avoid effort when effort is possible. But what the research on ADHD reveals is something fundamentally different. The ADHD brain is not choosing to disengage. It is following its neurochemical programming with perfect, predictable accuracy. In 2021, researchers at Cardiff University published findings showing that the dopamine system in ADHD brains responds differently to effort-based tasks. Specifically, the reward signal associated with completing effortful, familiar work is significantly weaker than in neurotypical brains. The ADHD brain runs the calculation and determines this effort is not worth the chemical cost. Effort-reward disconnected. This is precisely why stimulant medications work for so many people with ADHD. They do not create motivation from nothing. They raise baseline dopamine availability, giving the brain enough chemical fuel to engage with tasks that are no longer novel. But here is the uncomfortable truth that medication alone does not fully solve. Even with treatment, the underlying architecture remains. The ADHD brain is still a brain that experiences diminishing returns faster, crashes harder, and craves novelty more intensely than average. This is not a malfunction, it may be a design, and understanding why that design exists is where the conversation becomes genuinely fascinating, and where I will resolve something I promised you at the beginning. But first, there is an emotional layer to this cycle that most conversations completely overlook. The shame spiral. Now forget everything comfortable about this topic for a moment, because the dopamine crash is not the most destructive part of the ADHD cycle. What comes after the crash is when you abandon a project, when the spark dies and you walk away from something you promised yourself you would finish. There is a secondary psychological process that begins almost immediately. Shame, not mild regret, not disappointment. Shame, the deep, identity-level conviction that you are fundamentally flawed, that something is wrong with you at the core, that you cannot be trusted with your own ambitions or your own dreams. Shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. For people with ADHD, this shame accumulates with every abandoned project, every missed deadline, every well-meaning question that starts with, Whatever happened to that thing you were working on? Over years, the weight becomes crushing. And here is the cruel twist the research reveals. Shame does not break the cycle, it accelerates it. Shame accelerates the cycle. The more ashamed you feel about quitting, the more desperately you chase the next new beginning. Because starting something new feels like proof that you are not broken. The dopamine spike of a fresh beginning does not just feel good, it temporarily silences the shame narrative. So the cycle completes and restarts. Novelty triggers dopamine, dopamine crashes, shame arrives, and the only relief from shame is the next new project. The ADHD cycle is not only neurological, it is emotional. It is a feedback loop between brain chemistry and self-perception that most people carry silently for decades. But there is a paradox at the heart of ADHD that makes this even stranger, and far more revealing than anything we have discussed so far. Hyperfocus paradox. If you have been following this closely, something might be bothering you, a contradiction. If ADHD is about an inability to sustain attention and maintain motivation, then why can someone with ADHD spend 6, 8, 12 hours completely absorbed in something they love without noticing time pass at all? This phenomenon is called hyperfocus, and it is one of the most misunderstood and most revealing aspects of the entire ADHD experience. Hyperfocus occurs when the ADHD brain encounters a task that provides continuous, self-renewing dopamine stimulation. Video games are the classic example, engineered precisely for this, with constantly escalating challenges, immediate unpredictable rewards, and perpetual novelty. But it also happens with creative work, intense research, passionate conversations, and emergencies. Any stimulus that keeps generating novelty can lock the ADHD brain into hyperfocus. Hyperfocus is not discipline. It is not effort. It is not willpower. It is dopamine availability, sustained by a task that has not yet become familiar. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And hyperfocus proves something definitively. The capacity for intense, sustained focus absolutely exists in the ADHD brain. The question has never been whether they can focus. The question is what the brain will agree to chemically fuel. ADHD is not a focus deficit. It is a dopamine permission problem. This is why the label attention deficit has always been somewhat misleading. The attention is there. The selective neurochemical permission to deploy it, that is what fluctuates. But there is one more piece of this cycle that is rarely discussed openly, and it may be the most emotionally painful part of all. Rejection wounds. What I am about to tell you sounds extreme, but it has been consistently documented in clinical research across thousands of patients. Approximately 99% of adults with ADHD report experiencing something called rejection-sensitive dysphoria. That term was coined by Dr. William Dodson, a psychiatrist who spent years studying the emotional lives of ADHD patients. RSD describes an intense, almost unbearable emotional response to perceived rejection, failure, or criticism, even when that perception is imagined or inaccurate. For someone with ADHD, a single critical comment, from a manager, a partner, a stranger online, can trigger an emotional collapse that persists for hours or days, not because they are dramatic or oversensitive, because their brains literally process emotional pain through different neural pathways. Rejection for the ADHD brain does not register as disappointment. It registers as devastation. Now connect this to everything we have traced together. If every abandoned project ends in shame, and shame activates the fear of being truly seen as a failure, then starting new things becomes increasingly dangerous over time. Each new beginning carries the ghost of every previous ending. The person who starts everything and finishes nothing does not only have a dopamine problem, they have a wound. A deep, accumulated, quietly devastating belief that finishing is when the real failure becomes visible to everyone. Better to abandon the project than to finish it and discover you were never good enough. Abandon before the end. That is the logic the ADHD brain runs silently, automatically, beneath the level of conscious awareness. Once you see it, you cannot pretend this cycle is simple anymore. What comes next will permanently change how you see all of this. The design truth. Now, remember what I told you at the beginning, that researchers had mapped a precise neurochemical event in the ADHD brain that explains everything. This is that moment. Evolutionary psychologists at Harvard and the University of Chicago have proposed something extraordinary. The ADHD brain may not be a broken version of the normal brain. It may be an ancient version of it. Ancient. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, roughly 300,000 years, survival depended on behaviors that the ADHD brain is specifically wired to excel at. rapid response to novelty, hyper-focused attention during crises, aggressive exploration of new environments, continuous scanning for threats and opportunities. The ADHD brain is not optimized for sitting at a desk for 8 hours, completing the same repetitive task. It is optimized for hunting, exploring, responding, and surviving in an unpredictable world. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. The ADHD brain was built to adapt, but it was not built to repeat. The problem is not the brain. The problem is the world. Modern life, structured schools, linear careers, 30-year mortgages, repetitive desk work, is designed for the exact opposite neurological profile. What we call ADHD is largely a mismatch between an ancient nervous system and a contemporary environment. That is the hidden truth at the center of every abandoned project in your life. If you have recognized yourself in this video, comment genius or prisoner. Because that is the real question. Is the ADHD brain a gift trapped in the wrong century, or a prison the modern world built without knowing it? What comes next is what you actually do with this knowledge. Breaking free. But here is what nobody in the productivity world tells you about working with an ADHD brain. You cannot outsmart your dopamine system through willpower alone. The research is unambiguous. Willpower is a finite resource, and it depletes significantly faster in brains already operating under chronic dopamine deficit. Trying harder is not the answer. Understanding the architecture and designing around it, that is the answer, doctor. Russell Barkley calls this external scaffolding, building environmental structures that compensate for what the internal neurochemical system cannot sustain independently. In practice, this means deliberately engineering novelty into long-term projects by reframing each phase as a new beginning. It means building immediate, tangible rewards into progress milestones so the dopamine math changes. It means working in new environments to sustain novelty stimulation. 1. Reframe each project phase as a new beginning. 2. Create immediate rewards for progress milestones. 3. Change environments regularly to sustain novelty. 4. Build external accountability to replace internal dopamine. 5. Reduce shame by understanding the neurology, not the narrative. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. But the deepest work is the identity work. Because no strategy repairs a self-image built on decades of abandonment without also challenging the story. You are not someone who cannot finish things. You are someone whose brain requires more intentional architecture than most. Every abandoned project taught you something precise about the conditions your brain actually needs. Every shame spiral pointed toward the wound that deserves healing. The ADHD cycle is not a life sentence. It is a pattern, and patterns, once understood with clarity and compassion, can be redesigned. You started this video and you finished it. That matters more than you might realize right now. Everything we trace together. The novelty trap, the dopamine crash, the shame spiral, the rejection wounds, the evolutionary mismatch. None of it means you are broken. None of it means you are incapable or uncommitted or fundamentally flawed. It means you are carrying a nervous system built for a different world and doing your best to navigate an environment that was designed without you in mind. Not broken, just mismatched. The ADHD cycle repeats not because you lack discipline, but because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Seek out what fuels it, what makes it feel alive, what keeps the engine running. The problem was never your character. The problem was the gap between the brain you were given and the world you were handed. Know thyself. Knowing yourself, truly understanding the neurological architecture you live inside, is where every meaningful change begins. Every abandoned project is evidence that you felt something deeply, that you were moved, that your brain caught fire even if only briefly. The goal is not to be ashamed of those embers. The goal is to learn, finally, how to keep them burning. The cycle ends the moment understanding replaces shame. If you made it this far, comment dopamine crash, because you just proved that the right content can hold even the most restless, novelty-seeking brain for the full duration. And if someone in your life keeps starting everything and finishing nothing, send them this video, not to fix them, to help them finally understand themselves. Welcome to the Psyche Project. If this helped you understand your own brain a little better, subscribe. New explorations into the human psyche every week. See you in the next one.